The year is 1922, a Tuesday afternoon in November, the kind of gray, forgettable day where the lamplight comes on at 3 and the radiators clank with stubborn reluctance. Inside a limestone building on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan, a man sits at a walnut desk. He is not thinking about power. He is not contemplating the future of capitalism. He is thinking about salaries. More specifically, how to pay them. The problem is simple, brutally simple. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, one of 12 regional branches of America's young central bank, needs to earn money. Not metaphorical money, not policy money. Actual, tangible revenue to cover its operating expenses. Staff salaries, electricity bills, the cost of printing currency, the mundane machinery of bureaucracy. And the Reserve Bank, at this moment in history, is running dangerously close to broke. You see, here's what nobody tells you about the Federal Reserve when they teach you about it in economics class. In its infancy, it didn't create money the way conspiracy theorists imagine today. It was just a bank, a weird quasi-governmental bank with a confusing mandate and even more confusing revenue streams. The Fed earned income the old-fashioned way, by charging member banks for services, by collecting fees, by holding gold reserves and earning interest on the loans it extended. But in 1922, none of this was generating enough cash. So the man at the desk, we'll get to his name shortly because names in this story matter less than what people accidentally discovered, makes a decision. A boring decision, an accountant's decision. He decides the New York Fed should buy some government bonds. Not because he wants to manipulate interest rates, not because he's trying to stimulate the economy, not because he understands yet that this action will ripple through every bank, every business, every mortgage in America. He just needs the interest payments. Because government bonds pay interest, and interest is revenue, and revenue pays salaries. What he doesn't know, what nobody knows yet, is that he has just stumbled upon the most powerful economic tool ever created. He has stumbled upon a glitch in the financial matrix. He has found the God mode cheat code for the entire economy. And it happened completely by accident. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you need to understand the world before it. Rewind 8 years. December 23, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson signs the Federal Reserve Act into law. Champagne corks pop. Hands are shaken. The journalists write glowing headlines about financial stability and preventing panics. But here's the dirty secret. Nobody actually knows what they've just created. The Federal Reserve System wasn't designed by economists. It was designed by politicians. Specifically, politicians who were terrified of two things. One, another banking panic, like the catastrophic panic of 1907, which nearly destroyed the entire financial system. And two, giving too much power to New York bankers, because populist farmers in the Midwest hated Wall Street. So they built a compromise, a Frankenstein's monster of institutional design. Instead of one central bank, like the Bank of England or the Banque de France, America got 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each semi-autonomous, each with its own board of directors drawn from local businesses. These 12 banks were supposed to serve their regions. They would lend to local banks during credit crunches. They would clear checks. They would hold reserves. And overseeing all of this, in theory, was the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. 7 appointed governors, bureaucrats, political appointees. But the Washington Board had almost no real power. The regional banks did whatever they wanted. This wasn't a central bank. This was a federation of central banks, each doing their own thing, sometimes cooperating, often competing. And absolutely nobody, not the politicians, not the bankers, not the academics, understood how this Rube Goldberg machine of an institution was actually supposed to work. Because here's the thing about central banking in 1914. The science didn't exist yet. There was no Keynesian economics, no Milton Friedman, no Federal Open Market Committee, no inflation targeting, no Taylor rules. The entire field of monetary policy, the idea that a central bank could deliberately manipulate interest rates and money supply to steer the economy, hadn't been invented yet. The men running the Federal Reserve Banks in 1914 didn't think of themselves as economic puppet masters. They thought of themselves as bankers. And bankers in that era understood banking through one lens: the gold standard. The gold standard was simple, brutally simple. Money was backed by gold, period. If you wanted to create more money, you needed more gold. If you ran out of gold, you couldn't create money. The supply of money was determined by geology, by how much gold you could dig out of the ground in places like South Africa or California. Central banks under this system had one job: don't run out of gold. That's it. If people started demanding gold in exchange for paper currency, you raised interest rates to make holding your currency more attractive. If gold was flowing into your country, you could lower rates a bit. But the idea that you could deliberately expand or contract the money supply to fight recessions or inflation, heresy. The Federal Reserve in its first 8 years operated entirely within this framework. It lent money to banks, but only against collateral. It held gold reserves. It printed currency, but only in proportion to the gold it held. And when World War I erupted in 1914, everything went insane. Europe's economies collapsed into chaos. Gold started flowing out of Britain, France, Germany, into the United States. American banks were suddenly drowning in gold, which meant under the rules of the gold standard, they could expand the money supply. And expand they did. The 1920s began with a massive boom. Credit was everywhere. Factories hummed. Automobile production soared. The stock market climbed. Fortunes were made overnight in Florida real estate schemes, in margin trading, in speculation. But by 1920, the bubble started turning into a bubble. And in 1921, the bubble popped. The economy contracted sharply. Unemployment spiked. Prices collapsed. Banks failed. It was the worst recession since the 1890s. And the Federal Reserve did almost nothing. Because they didn't know they could do anything. The gold standard was still the law of the land. Interest rates were determined by gold flows, not by deliberate policy. The idea that the Fed could intervene to stop a recession hadn't crystallized yet. Oh, there were hints, whispers, academic papers buried in journals. But institutional knowledge, operational doctrine, none. Which brings us back to that Tuesday afternoon in November 1922. The recession is over, barely. The economy is limping along. And inside the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a small group of men are staring at a budget shortfall. They need money. And that's when someone suggested, why don't we just buy some government bonds? His name was Benjamin Strong, and if you've never heard of him, that's because history has a funny way of forgetting the people who accidentally stumble into greatness. Benjamin Strong was not a theorist. He was not an academic. He had never written a PhD thesis on monetary policy or published in the American Economic Review. He was a banker, a practical man, a problem solver. Born in 1872 in Fishkill, New York, Strong started his career as a clerk at a small trust company. He worked his way up through sheer competence, learning the mechanics of banking, the art of credit assessment, the rhythm of the financial markets. By 1904, he was working at Bankers Trust Company in New York. By 1909, its president. And in 1914, when the Federal Reserve System was being assembled like a financial IKEA bookshelf, Strong was tapped to become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He didn't want the job. He'd just gone through a brutal divorce. His wife had died by suicide, a scandal that haunted him. His health was fragile. He suffered from chronic tuberculosis, which would eventually kill him in 1928. But J.P. Morgan himself, the most powerful banker in America, personally asked Strong to take the position. And when J.P. Morgan asks, you don't say no. Strong accepted, and from 1914 to 1928, he became the single most influential figure in American monetary policy, More powerful than the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, more influential than any Treasury Secretary. But in 1922, he was still figuring things out. Strong was a curious man. He read voraciously economic journals, financial reports, correspondence from European central bankers. He traveled frequently to London, where he met with Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. Norman and Strong became close friends. They exchanged letters constantly, discussing gold flows, interest rates, currency stabilization. And it was through these conversations that Strong began to suspect something radical. Maybe, just maybe, the Federal Reserve had more power than anyone realized. But suspicion is not proof. Theory is not practice. Strong needed a reason to test this hypothesis. And in November 1922, he got one. The New York Fed was facing an operating deficit. Expenses were outpacing revenue. The bank needed to earn more income, and fast. The board of directors convened a meeting. The solution was obvious: buy government bonds. U.S. Treasury bonds were safe, liquid, and they paid interest. The New York Fed could purchase bonds in the open market, hold them as assets, and collect the interest payments. Simple, clean, profitable. The kind of thing that wouldn't even make the financial press. But then something strange happened. Within days, literally within days, bankers across New York started reporting an unusual phenomenon. Interest rates were falling. Not because of gold flows, not because of seasonal credit demand, but because the market was suddenly flooded with cash. You see, when the Fed bought those $30 million in bonds, they didn't pay for them by withdrawing gold from a vault or by collecting taxes. They paid for them by crediting the seller's accounts. They created the money out of thin air. Now, this wasn't technically printing money, no physical bills were printed, but electronically the effect was identical. The Fed purchased $30 million in bonds. The bond dealers, J.P. Morgan, National City, received $30 million in deposits at their respective banks. Those banks now had $30 million in new reserves, and under the fractional reserve system, those reserves could be multiplied. Let's walk through the mechanics, because this is where the magic happens. Say J.P. Morgan and Company sells $10 million in bonds to the Fed. The Fed credits J.P. Morgan's account at Chase National Bank with $10 million. Chase now has $10 million in new deposits. Under the reserve requirements of the time, Chase only had to hold 10% of deposits as reserves. So out of that $10 million, Chase held $1 million in reserve and lent out $9 million. That $9 million got deposited into other banks, let's say National City. National City held $900,000 in reserve and lent out $8.1 million, and so on, and so on. This is called the money multiplier effect. That initial $30 million injection didn't just add $30 million to the economy, it added hundreds of millions because banks could lend and relend again. More money in the system meant more credit available. More credit meant lower interest rates. Lower interest rates meant businesses could borrow more cheaply. And Benjamin Strong, watching from his office on Liberty Street, saw the whole thing unfold in real time. He hadn't intended to lower interest rates. He'd just been trying to pay the bills. But the result was undeniable. The Federal Reserve had discovered a superpower. Strong wasn't an idiot. He understood immediately what had happened. And more importantly, he understood what it meant. In early 1923, Strong convened an informal committee, a group of senior officials from the New York Fed and a few of the other regional reserve banks. They called it the Open Market Investment Committee. Not the Open Market Operations Committee, not yet, because they weren't operating anything deliberately, they were still experimenting. The mandate was simple: figure out if this thing was a fluke or if it was repeatable. Could the Fed buy bonds on purpose to lower rates? Could it sell bonds to raise rates? Could it actually steer the economy? Over the next 2 years, Strong and his team ran a series of quiet, methodical tests. In 1923, the Fed bought another $50 million in bonds. Rates dropped. In 1924, the Fed bought $100 million. Rates dropped further. In 1925, they sold $80 million, and rates rose. It worked. Every time. Buying bonds equals more reserves equals lower rates. Selling bonds equals fewer reserves equals higher rates. It was like discovering a hidden lever in the control room of capitalism. And the wildest part? Almost nobody outside the Fed even noticed. The financial press didn't cover it. Economists didn't write about it. Congress didn't debate it. Because the Fed's bond purchases were buried in dense, technical financial reports that nobody read. They looked like routine portfolio management, boring bank stuff. But inside the Federal Reserve, the realization was spreading like wildfire. By 1926, the Fed had formalized the process. The Open Market Investment Committee became a permanent fixture. Meetings were scheduled quarterly, procedures were documented, and the language started to change. They stopped calling it buying bonds to earn income. They started calling it open market operations, a phrase that sounds technical and sterile, but actually means something profound. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because once you discover a superpower, you have to decide how to use it. And in 1927, Benjamin Strong made a decision that would echo through history. A decision that some would later blame for the greatest economic catastrophe of the 20th century. The summer of 1927 was hot, unbearably hot, the kind of heat that makes even New Yorkers slow down. But inside the Federal Reserve, the pressure was building. Europe was in trouble. Britain, in particular, was struggling. The British pound, still the world's dominant reserve currency, was under attack. Gold was flowing out of London and into New York. Under the gold standard, this created a brutal dilemma for the Bank of England. To stop the gold outflow, Britain needed to raise interest rates, make holding pounds more attractive. But raising rates would crush the British economy, which was already fragile. Montague Norman, Strong's close friend and the governor of the Bank of England, was desperate. He traveled to New York in July 1927 for secret meetings with Strong. The conversations were frank. Norman needed help. If Britain's economy collapsed, it could trigger a cascade of defaults across Europe. Germany was still recovering from hyperinflation. France's currency was shaky. Norman asked Strong, could the Federal Reserve lower interest rates in the U.S.? Lower U.S. interest rates would make American investments less attractive. Gold would flow out of New York and into London. Britain could stabilize without raising rates. It was elegant, but it was also dangerous. Because in 1927, the American economy was booming. The stock market was climbing, credit was expanding, speculation was rampant. People were buying stocks on margin, borrowing money to gamble on Wall Street. The bubble inflated and inflated and inflated. And in October 1929, it burst. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. The stock market collapsed. Fortunes evaporated. Banks failed. The Great Depression began. And in the years that followed, a narrative emerged. It was the Fed's fault. Economists, led by Austrian school thinkers like Ludwig Mises and later Friedrich Hayek, argued that the Fed's rate cuts in 1927 had artificially inflated the bubble. By creating easy money, the Fed had distorted investment decisions, encouraged reckless speculation, and set the stage for collapse. Was this true? That's still debated today. Some economists blame the Fed. Others argue the Depression had deeper structural causes: global trade imbalances, the gold standard, protectionist tariffs. But here's what's undeniable. By 1927, the Federal Reserve had learned it could manipulate the economy. And in trying to help Britain, it had accidentally supercharged Wall Street. Benjamin Strong never saw the crash. He died in October 1928, exactly 1 year before Black Tuesday. Tuberculosis finally claimed him at age 55. He died believing he'd done the right thing. He died not knowing that his name would forever be associated with the catastrophe to come. Here's the thing about discovering a superpower. You can't undiscover it. After the Depression, after World War II, after decades of economic crises and experiments, the Federal Reserve fully embraced what Benjamin Strong had stumbled upon in 1922. Open market operations became the primary tool of monetary policy, not interest rates set by gold flows, not reserve requirements, but buying and selling bonds to control the money supply. Today, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, meets 8 times a year. They don't meet to pay the electric bill. They meet to decide, should we create more money or destroy some? Should we buy bonds, expanding credit, lowering interests, stimulating the economy? Or should we sell bonds, contracting credit, raising rates, cooling things down? It's the most powerful economic lever in the world, and it was discovered by accident. But the story doesn't end there, because once you give a central bank this kind of power, a new question emerges. What happens when they use it wrong? Benjamin Strong died on October 16, 1928. The funeral was held at the Church of the Heavenly Rest on Fifth Avenue. Dignitaries attended, bankers in black suits, politicians offering condolences. The New York Times ran a glowing obituary, calling him the most influential central banker in American history. But what they didn't mention, what nobody could have known at the time, was this: Benjamin Strong had taken a secret with him to the grave. Not a written secret, not a conspiracy, but a kind of institutional knowledge that existed only in his head. You see, Strong had spent 14 years refining the art of central banking. He understood, intuitively, almost instinctively, how open market operations worked. He knew when to buy bonds and when to pull back. He knew how to read the tea leaves of the economy, the price of commodities, the flow of gold, the mood of Wall Street. He knew how much was too much, and when he died, that knowledge died with him. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington, those 7 political appointees who were supposed to be running the show, had never really understood what Strong was doing. They saw him as a loose cannon, an imperialist. The New York Fed had always operated semi-independently, and Washington resented it. When Strong died, they saw an opportunity. The board moved quickly. They asserted control. They demanded that all 12 regional Fed banks coordinate their open market operations through Washington. No more freelancing. No more New York calling the shots. Everything by committee. Everything by consensus. And in the process, they neutered the one tool that might have saved the American economy. October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed. Panic consumed Wall Street. Margin calls cascaded. Fortunes evaporated in hours. But here's what most people don't understand about the Great Depression. The stock market crash didn't cause the depression. It was just the opening act. What turned a painful recession into a decade-long catastrophe was what happened next. Or rather, what didn't happen. Between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. money supply contracted by approximately 1/3. 1/3. Imagine if tomorrow, the total amount of dollars in the economy, every bank account, every loan, every paycheck, suddenly shrank by 33%. That's what happened. Banks failed. Not a few banks, thousands of banks. When a bank fails, the deposits disappear. The money simply ceases to exist. And when people saw banks failing, they panicked. They withdrew their savings, which caused more banks to fail, which caused more panic. It was a death spiral. And the Federal Reserve, the institution specifically created to prevent bank panics, stood by and watched. Why? Because they'd forgotten how to use the weapon. Decades later, in 1963, two economists would publish a book that would change how we understand the Depression forever. The book was A Monetary History of the United States. The authors were Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. Friedman was already famous, a Chicago school economist, a champion of free markets, a thorn in the Keynesian orthodoxy. But this book was different. This book was a forensic autopsy. Friedman and Schwartz spent years combing through Federal Reserve meeting minutes, monetary data, correspondence between regional Fed banks, and what they found was damning. Here's what Friedman argued. The Federal Reserve had the power to stop the Depression. They had the tool, open market operations. They could have flooded the economy with money, propped up failing banks, prevented the money supply from collapsing. Benjamin Strong would have known what to do. But Strong was dead, and the bureaucrats who replaced him didn't understand the tool they'd inherited. Look at the numbers. In 1929, the Fed held approximately $500 million in government securities, bonds they'd purchased through open market operations. By 1933, they held $500 million, unchanged. They didn't buy bonds, they didn't inject liquidity, they didn't do anything. In fact, they did worse than nothing. They raised interest rates. In 1931, with the economy in fail-fall, the Fed raised the discount rate, the rate at which it lent to banks, from 1.5% to 3.5%. Why? Because gold was flowing out of the United States, and under the rules of the gold standard, you raised rates to stop gold flows. The Fed was still operating like it was 1914, still thinking in terms of gold flows and reserve ratios. They'd learned nothing from Strong's experiments. Friedman's conclusion was brutal. The Federal Reserve System was established to prevent bank panics. It failed. More than that, it didn't just fail, it caused the catastrophe. By refusing to act, by clinging to outdated doctrines, the Fed turned what should have been a normal recession into the worst economic collapse in modern history. Friedman called it the Fed's greatest failure. Now, you might be wondering, if Friedman figured this out in 1963, did anyone learn the lesson? Oh, they learned, but it took another catastrophe first. The 1970s were weird. Not weird in a fun way, weird in the entire global economic order is collapsing way. In 1971, President Nixon did something unprecedented. He ended the gold standard, not temporarily, permanently. Nixon on archival audio. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That word, temporarily, was a lie. It's been 54 years. We're still waiting. For the first time in history, the US dollar was backed by nothing. No gold, no silver, no commodity, just faith, trust in the US government. And here's the thing, this should have been terrifying, because remember, the whole reason the gold standard existed was to impose discipline on governments. If you printed too much money, you'd run out of gold. Simple. But now, no constraints, no limits. The Fed could create as much money as they wanted. And in the 1970s, they did exactly that. The money supply exploded. Inflation surged. By 1980, inflation hit 13.5%. Prices doubled in less than a decade. This was the nightmare scenario that gold standard advocates had always warned about. Give the government a printing press and they'll destroy the currency. But then something unexpected happened. A man named Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, and Volcker was a maniac. Volcker stood 6'7". He smoked cheap cigars, he wore rumpled suits, he looked like a character out of a noir film. And he had one goal: kill inflation. Volcker understood something fundamental. The Fed's power to create money could be used in both directions. You could expand the money supply to fight recessions like Strong had done in the 1920s, but you could also contract it to fight inflation. Volcker raised interest rates to levels never seen before or since. The federal funds rate, the Fed's key policy rate, hit 20% in June 1981. 20%. To understand how insane that is, when you bought a house in 1981, you paid 20% on interest on your mortgage. Credit card rates were 25%. Car loans, 18%. The economy screamed. Unemployment hit 10.8%. Factories shut down. Construction stopped. Farmers went bankrupt because they couldn't refinance their loans. Protesters descended on Washington. They mailed 2x4s to Volcker with messages like, "This is all I have left of my business." But Volcker didn't flinch. He kept rates high, kept the pressure on. And it worked. By 1983, inflation had collapsed from 13.5% to 3.2%. Volcker had proven something crucial. The Fed's weapon, open market operations, interest rate manipulation, money supply control, could be controlled. It wasn't a runaway train, it was a scalpel. And that realization set the stage for the modern era of central banking. In 1987, a new chairman took over the Fed. His name was Alan Greenspan, and for the next 18 years, he would be worshipped like a god. Greenspan was different from Volcker. Where Volcker was blunt, Greenspan was cryptic. Where Volcker smoked cigars, Greenspan spoke in riddles. He once famously said, "If I seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what I said." But beneath the obfuscation, Greenspan had a philosophy. The Fed should be reactive, not proactive. Watch the economy, wait for problems, then act. And for nearly 2 decades, it seems to work. The stock market boomed, the economy grew. Recessions were short and shallow. Inflation stayed low. Greenspan earned a nickname, the Maestro. He was conducting the economy like a symphony, raising rates a quarter point here, lowering them a quarter point there, always staying one step ahead of disaster. But there was a problem. Greenspan had a blind spot. He didn't believe in asset bubbles. Or rather, he didn't believe the Fed should try to stop them. When tech stocks soared in the late 1990s, Greenspan shrugged. "Markets are efficient," he said. "Who are we to second-guess investors?" When housing prices doubled between 2000 and 2006, Greenspan dismissed concerns. "There's no national housing bubble," he testified. He was wrong. And in 2008, the world paid the price. September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest, most prestigious investment banks on Wall Street, filed for bankruptcy. $600 billion in assets, gone overnight. The financial system seized up like an engine without oil. Banks stopped lending, credit markets froze. The stock market cratered, losing half its value in 6 months. It was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And this time, the Fed didn't hesitate. The new chairman was Bernanke, a Princeton economist who'd spent his career studying the Depression. Bernanke knew Friedman's work intimately. He'd internalized the lesson. The Fed's greatest sin in the 1930s was inaction. So Bernanke acted. First, he slashed interest rates to zero, literally zero. The federal funds rate hit 0 to 0.25%. But that wasn't enough, because when you've already cut rates to zero, you can't cut them any lower. You've run out of room. So Bernanke did something radical. He went back to Benjamin Strong's playbook, open market operations, but not 30 million in bond purchases, not 300 million, trillions. They called it quantitative easing, QE for short, a fancy term for the Fed is buying a massive amount of bonds to inject cash into the economy. Between 2008 and 2014, the Fed purchased over $3.5 trillion in government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. To put that in perspective, in 2007, the Fed's balance sheet, the total value of assets it held, was $800 billion. By 2014, it was $4.5 trillion. The Fed had quintupled its balance sheet in 6 years. It was the single largest expansion of the money supply in American history. And it worked. The economy stabilized, banks stopped failing, the stock market recovered, and then soared to record highs. Unemployment fell from 10% in 2009 to 4.7% by 2016. Bernanke was hailed as a hero, the man who saved the economy. But there was a catch. Here's the thing about creating trillions of dollars. That money has to go somewhere. And where it went was not to ordinary people. It went to asset owners. See, when the Fed buys bonds, it doesn't mail checks to citizens. It doesn't deposit money into your bank account. It buys bonds from financial institutions, banks, hedge funds, pension funds. Those institutions then take that cash and invest it in stocks, in real estate, in corporate bonds. So asset prices skyrocketed. If you owned a house, your net worth went up. If you owned stocks, your portfolio ballooned. If you owned a business, its valuation skyrocketed. But if you didn't own assets, if you were just working a job, earning a salary, you got nothing. Between 2008 and 2020, the wealth of the top 1% in America doubled. The median household, their wealth barely budged. This wasn't a side effect. This was the design. The Fed's strategy was based on something called the wealth effect, the idea that when people feel richer because their stock portfolios are up, they spend more, which stimulates the economy. But the wealth effect only works if you have wealth to begin with. The Fed had accidentally, or not so accidentally, built a machine for concentrating wealth. And when COVID hit in 2020, they supercharged it. March 2020, the world shut down. Offices closed, stores shuttered, unemployment spiked to levels not seen since the Depression. And the Fed's response? We're not going to run out of ammunition. That's what Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said. Translation? We're going to print as much money as it takes. And they did. In just 6 months, March to September 2020, the Fed purchased $3 trillion in bonds. $3 trillion in 6 months. For context, it took the Fed 6 years to buy $3.5 trillion during the 2008 crisis. By the end of 2014, the Fed's balance sheet had ballooned to $8.5 trillion. $8.5 trillion. And once again, the money flowed into assets. The stock market, despite a global pandemic, despite mass unemployment, hit all-time highs. Housing prices surged. Cryptocurrencies went parabolic. Billionaires got richer. Elon Musk's net worth went from $24 billion to $200 billion in 18 months. Jeff Bezos added $75 billion. But here's where the story gets really interesting. This time, the money didn't stay in assets, because the government also sent checks directly to people. Stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment benefits, forgivable business loans. And when you combine trillions in Fed money creation with trillions in government spending, something inevitable happens. Inflation. By 2022, inflation hit 9.1%, the highest level in 40 years. And suddenly, the magic trick didn't feel so magical anymore. Here's the fundamental paradox of the Fed's power. It's a weapon that only works if people don't realize it's a weapon. Think about it. The Fed creates money by buying bonds, but those bonds are just pieces of paper, IOUs from the government. The dollars the Fed creates to buy those bonds, also just pieces of paper, or electrons in a computer, ones and zeros. The whole system runs on belief. Belief that dollars have value. Belief that the Fed won't create too many dollars. Belief that inflation won't spiral out of control. And as long as people believe, the system works. The Fed can create trillions of dollars and the economy hums along. But the moment people stop believing, the moment they look at the Fed's $8.5 trillion balance sheet and think, this is insane, the whole thing falls apart. That's what happened in 2022. People started noticing. Gas prices doubled, rent spiked, groceries got expensive, and they started asking questions. If the Fed can just create money out of thin air, why do we have poverty? If they can print $3 trillion in 6 months, why can't they cancel student debt? If dollars aren't backed by gold, what are they backed by? These are dangerous questions, because once you start pulling on that thread, the whole sweater unravels. Let's go back to where we started. November 22, 1922. Benjamin Strong, the accidental discovery. What if Strong had never bought those bonds? What if the Fed had never discovered it could manipulate interest rates through open market operations? Would the Great Depression have been avoided? Or would it have been worse? Would the 2008 crisis have destroyed the global economy? Or would markets have corrected naturally? We'll never know. Because once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back. Today, the Federal Reserve is the most powerful economic institution on Earth. It controls the world's reserve currency. Its decisions affect every country, every market, every person. And at the heart of that power is a tool discovered by accident in 1922. But here's what they don't teach you in economics class. The Fed doesn't actually know what it's doing. Oh, they have PhD economists, they have sophisticated models, they have terabytes of data. But ultimately, they're making educated guesses. When they set interest rates, they're guessing what inflation will be in 6 months. When they buy bonds, they're guessing how much liquidity the economy needs. When they talk about normalizing the balance sheet, they're guessing what normal even means anymore. The dirty secret of central banking is that it's an art, not a science. It's Benjamin Strong staring at bond prices in 1922, wondering what happens if I buy a few more. It's Paul Volcker in 1981 raising rates to 20% and hoping it doesn't trigger a revolution. It's Bernanke in 2008 creating trillions of dollars and praying it doesn't cause hyperinflation. They're making it up as they go along. So here's the question that haunts modern economics. If the Fed can create infinite money, if it can buy bonds, lower rates, inject liquidity, prevent recessions, why do we ever have economic crises at all? The optimist's answer is because the Fed is cautious. They've learned from history. They know that creating too much money causes inflation, destroys savings, wrecks the economy. The pessimist's answer is because the Fed serves the wealthy. QE inflates asset prices, which helps the rich. It doesn't help workers. And the Fed is run by Wall Street people, for Wall Street. The realist's answer is because the Fed has limits. It can create money, but it can't create real wealth. It can't build factories, train workers, invent technologies. All it can do is shuffle financial claims around. Which answer is correct? All of them. None of them. Because the truth is, we're still living in the experiment that began in 1922. We're still trying to figure out what happens when you give a handful of people the power to create money at will. We're still discovering the unintended consequences. There's an old economic saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. It means that everything has a cost, even if it's hidden, even if it's delayed. When the Fed creates money to bail out banks, someone pays for it, through inflation, through currency devaluation, through taxes. When the Fed holds interest rates at zero for a decade, someone pays for it, through asset bubbles, through pension fund shortfalls, through financial instability. The bill always comes due. In 2022 and 2023, the Fed raised interest rates faster than at any point in modern history, from 0% to 5.5% in 18 months. Why? Because the bill came due. The trillions created during COVID triggered inflation, and to fight inflation, the Fed had to destroy money by selling bonds, raising rates, contracting the money supply. And here's the cruel irony. The tool that was discovered to prevent economic pain in 1922 has now become a tool that causes economic pain. When the Fed raises rates, people lose their homes, businesses go bankrupt, jobs disappear. The same weapon, different casualties. Let's return one last time to that room in 1922. Benjamin Strong, sitting at his desk, ledger open. He didn't know he was about to change the world. He just needed to pay the electric bill. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The most powerful economic tool in history, the ability to create money from nothing, to manipulate interest rates, to steer the global economy, wasn't invented by a genius, wasn't designed by a committee, wasn't planned. It was an accident, a glitch in the system, a cheat code discovered by mistake. And once they realized what they'd found, they couldn't unknow it. Today, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stands at over $7 trillion. Every dollar of that, every single dollar, was created the same way Benjamin Strong created that first $30 million in 1922, by buying bonds, by crediting accounts, by typing numbers into a computer. It's the closest thing to magic the modern world has. And like all magic, it comes with a price. The question isn't whether the Fed can create infinite money. They already proved they can. The question is what happens when they do. And we're still figuring that out. 103 years after Benjamin Strong bought those bonds, we're still living in the world he accidentally created. A world when money is no longer scarce, where central banks are the most powerful institutions on Earth, where the line between genius and catastrophe is thinner than anyone wants to admit. This is the story of the day the Fed discovered infinite money. And this is the world we built on that discovery. There's one more thing. Friedman, archival audio. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It can only be produced by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. Milton Friedman said that in 1963, 62 years ago. And yet, in 2020, when the Fed created trillions of dollars, economists assured us this time is different. Modern monetary theory says we won't get inflation. They were wrong. Which brings us to the final lesson. Every generation believes they've figured out how to control the weapon. Every generation believes they're smarter than the ones who came before. And every generation learns too late that the weapon was never fully under control in the first place. Benjamin Strong thought he could manage easy money in 1927. He died before the crash. Alan Greenspan thought asset bubbles would self-correct. He was wrong. Then Bernanke thought QE wouldn't cause inflation. He was partially right, until he wasn't. Today, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve insist they have everything under control. The money supply is managed, inflation is beaten, the economy is stable. Maybe they're right. Or maybe, just maybe, we're still in the middle of the experiment that began in 1922. And the final chapter hasn't been written yet. The day the Fed discovered infinite money. They're still learning what to do with it. And so are we.